This is Join Us in France, episode 216. Bonjour, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France, its many quirks, its history, its language, and of course, the itineraries and destinations in France, because hopefully you'll be visiting soon. On today's episode, Elyse shares her wealth of knowledge about stained glass windows in France. Those windows almost always explore religious themes, so we'll take stops at several cathedrals that are worth visiting just to admire the stained glass. For example, most of the glass you see at the Chartres Cathedral today was installed between 1205 and 1240. I don't know about you, but that makes me feel small. Some of these churches are so tall that you can only see a lot of the detail of the stained glass with the help of binoculars or zoom lenses. As you know, if you've been following the podcast for a while, I love photography, and one of the challenges I've taken on is to photograph details of stained glass windows, even the ones that are perched up all the way up there. And if you want to see the intricacy of those windows, visit joinusinfrance.com/216, where you'll see a lot of photos in the show notes. Look for the blue button that says show notes under joinusinfrance.com/216. Maybe this is something you've never thought about, but many modern cameras are so good at capturing light that they do a better job than the naked eye at seeing color. I've been in situations where my eyes see what I consider to be, subdued or drab colors, but I take a photo and the camera captures a lot more detail in the range of color. Either that or my eyes are lousy, I don't know. So let's talk about gorgeous colors and cathedrals in France. Join Us in France is brought to you by Patreon supporters and Addicted to France, the small group tour company for people who want to enjoy France to the fullest with zero stress. At least we hope so. The time is fast running out to book our upcoming tour in September 2019 in the Dordogne. You won't be able to buy it after December 26, 2018. So I do that so there's no problem booking hotels and plane tickets and all of that way in advance. The Dordogne is such a sweet place in the fall. You should really check it out, and it would make for an amazing Christmas gift, I think. At the end of my conversation with Elyse, I'll give you an update about the Gilets jaunes situation. Things are getting better, but there's quite a bit more to it than that, as you will see. And a reminder that I will release an episode on French Christmas songs next Sunday, December 23rd. And then the next episode after that won't be until January 13th. So I'm taking a little break for a family vacation, but I'll release Patreon rewards between Christmas and New Year. I hope all of you will get a chance to spend some time with family and friends this holiday season, enjoy some great food, maybe a little wine, maybe start thinking about your next trip to France. How about that? Hello, Elyse.
Hi, Annie.
We are talking about, stained glass.
Stained glass.
Ooh.
Stained glass.
Pretty stuff.
Pretty stuff, yes.
Yes.
Yes, you and I both love this stuff.
I love to try and take pictures of them.
You like to take pictures of them. I like to stick my nose up against it and try and absorb the color into my brain, actually. Which is the only place that I know of where you can actually do that is in the Cluny Museum.
Yes,
in
because
Paris.
they're up close.
They're up close, and they have sections of the old, beautiful stuff with the tiny pieces, and you can actually stick your nose against it practically, you know? But that doesn't make it go into my brain, actually.
One of the nice things about the Cluny Museum is that you can see the stained glass window really up close.
Really up close, yes. So, and stained glass, interesting, I was looking this up today, the term in English is much more ambiguous than in French, because in French we have the term vitraux.
Yeah.
Vitrail, vitraux, plural, right?
Yeah.
Which is specifically the colored glass used in windows.
Yes.
Whereas stained glass in English can mean colored glass, where the color is actually in the glass
Yes.
from its inception,
Yeah.
or glass with a stain painted on it.
On top.
And so it's not as specific in terms of the history, if you want to look it up, So I thought it was really interesting because there is a divergence in the way we use it. And of course, in the history of stained glass, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I was thinking, we talk a lot about what tourists go to see, especially when they go to Paris. And now more and more, I think people who've been to France at least once or twice, and they go other parts of France. And I think one of the things that people are fascinated by, when they go into the cathedrals or the Sainte-Chapelle, is the stained glass.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of it, how it came to be so important, and then mention some other cathedrals, mostly cathedrals, it turns out, other than the two most famous ones in Paris, that are really beautiful to go and visit.
Where you can see remarkable stained glass.
Remarkable stained glass. And also because the history of it is so incredible. And part of that history that's incredible is that there are still many cathedrals in France, in spite of the problems with World War I and World War II, that have a lot of the original glass.
True.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Right?
Agreed.
So I thought, okay, let's do one. And you said, fine. So here we are.
Yes, It sounds interesting to me.
So I'm not sure what the absolute beginning origins of glass are, but we do know that the Egyptians and the Romans, about even 200 BC, were making glass. They were making small objects or pieces of glass because it requires an enormous amount of heat to make glass. It's based on silicates, basically sand, and minerals that are ground together, and some binder, which it turns out the term is actually a flux, which can be some kind of sodic in French, which is, I think, sodium, but I'm not sure. Sodic, which I think is like bicarbonate or carbonate of soda or something like that.
So SODIQUE?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So we do know, there are pieces that are that can be seen in museums, even in the Louvre and places like that, of teeny little pieces of glass. And glass was very, very, very precious because it was so hard to make. Unlike ceramics, it requires a temperature of something like over 1,000 degrees Celsius.
Which is really hard to get to. Yeah, even a modern oven that's made for bakeries will probably go to...
What? I have no idea. 300? Would it go up to...
No, F. 700 F, maybe. Yeah. So in C, that would be 275.
275, right?
Maybe 300 if you're pushing it.
Right.
It's dangerous beyond that.
It's very dangerous, And if anybody's ever visited Murano, which I've been to several times and I find fascinating. The heat that comes off of these furnaces when they melt the glass to make it's absolutely incredible. So
because Fahrenheit 451,
right?
That's the temperature where paper self-ignites.
Exactly.
So it gets
it's very hot. Yeah. So of course it required the sand and all these other chemicals, but it also required an enormous amount of heat, and so that is why. Anybody who's ever noticed, you will see that the first glass is not clear because the transparency without color comes from even a higher temperature. And that was, at the time, absolutely impossible to make. Mm-hmm. But what happened was that little by little, the Romans, who we know were absolutely incredible at, they were technical, they were technological for their time. They were engineers. Yeah. They were people who figured things out.
Yeah, they had a lot of know-how.
They started making pieces of glass, colored glass, to use as pieces in their mosaics. aside from tiny little objects like for incense or perfume, because perfume was oiled in those days, the most important use of glass at the time was to be broken up into tiny, teeny little pieces to be then used in the mosaics which were placed in all of the most important buildings and rich people's houses, which were mostly on the floor, but sometimes on the walls.
Yeah.
So think about that for a second, because later on, when we get up into the Middle Ages, the very first stained glass, the most beautiful, in my opinion, which is the earliest, is in fact inspired by this idea of mosaics, which is why it's thousands and thousands of tiny little pieces.
Right.
And also for technological reason. So it turns out that the Romans did indeed use it for a little bit of window, but very small amounts, because number one, they could not make more than tiny little pieces, and we're talking flat now, relatively flat. And they weren't sure how to hold the pieces together. And it turns out, I didn't know, that at first they tried using wood, the little framing around the little pieces, which of course didn't work very long because it allowed moisture in, and then things would fall apart.
Right. And the wood's going to...
And the wood just would rot away, especially if it was an outside window facing something. Yeah. So it turns out that one of the oldest pieces of glass is still in Italy, and it's in the town of Ravenna.
Okay.
And the reason why is because there's a magnificent church, a very small Byzantine-style church in Ravenna that has glass that's basically from the 400s. And it's teeny little pieces, So it was used really in this decorative kind of way.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
So they didn't have windows like we have them today.
No. The windows were basically, most of the time, very, very rich people could have very small little openings that they would put some colored glass in because it was a sign of riches, if you could do that. Yeah. Otherwise, even in early churches, the windows were often closed with wooden shutters on the inside, and then they were covered with skin, that was made into parchment so that it was translucent. And they would paint color on that to give it a pretty look, to give it an aspect that was not just the color of, I don't know what the technique is, because it's kind of like tanning leather, except that you actually work it so that it's translucent and you dye out whatever the natural color is, since if it's leather from an animal. But then they would actually do some painting, just like it was a fresco on it. But basically, there were no windows as such at the time. I mean, glass was just it was too rare a commodity to be used in that way until you get till about the 5th century AD.
Okay.
At which time, because there were lots of artists and workers who were starting to use glass to make small objects, and they became more and more interested in the idea of trying to make objects with color, they eventually, by little, worked on making bigger objects. But the pieces of glass never got very big.
Okay. Because
they didn't know how to make sheet glass or big sections of glass like that. It just was not done at the time. And I think it was largely for purely technological reasons. They couldn't figure out how to do it. But it turns out, and I didn't realize it, that there was actually I was in Ravenna once, the very, very, very first time I came to Europe, which means in prehistoric times, before there was electricity. And I actually went to Ravenna because even then I was already starting to study art history, and I had read that there were these absolutely gorgeous golden mosaics in this small church, which still is there, and I actually would love to go back right now and see it. But what I don't remember, but it turns out that there was a very, very, very small rose window. Now, when I say a rose window, you and I think of rose windows like the ones in Notre Dame, which are humongous.
Yeah.
Now, this one, I would guess, and I'm holding up my hands, was what? Like maybe 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters around,
Yeah.
I mean, that was it. That they couldn't, and it was stone casing and wood in between holding the little pieces together. Okay. And that was as good as they could get. When they had beautiful shimmering color and mosaics on the walls, the color is very beautiful, but it's on a solid background. So you don't get the light really coming through. It reflects the light of candles in front of it.
Okay.
But it's not the same effect as stained glass windows that actually have the light piercing through, from the inside and outside. But that was actually the beginning. It was like, so thanks to the Romans, we have the first idea of decorating what amounts to the first churches with some glass, but on this very modest scale. Economically, I think it was just far too difficult to do. What's interesting to know is that it was in the 600s or 700s in France that there was a push to figure out how to put more glass in the churches. So this is way before Gothic architecture.
Yeah.
It's still the idea of using it as a decorative element, just having some color.
A little bit.
These bullseyes, the round ones in the Romanesque old little churches, they were not very big. Because it's very interesting, but everything that the Romans did was always considered very prestigious. And since they had come up with this idea, and they were also, by the time you get to the 600s and 700s, you have the development of reliquary boxes. And they used mosaic for making a lot of the reliquary boxes because it was inspired by the mosaics that they had pretty much everywhere where the Romans had been.
Okay.
Still vestiges of it everywhere on the floors and things like that. So they basically copied it to make these objects. And you and I have both seen reliquary boxes. Some of them look like houses. They have like these, they look like a roof on a house with little windows and doors and things like that.
True.
And that was one of the next things that they did with little pieces of glass. They added them to these kind of strange objects, which of course held some kind of vestige of a saint at the time. But it wasn't until somebody or a group of people figured out how to use lead piping to hold the little pieces of glass, partly, of course, because it's soft, but also it turns out to be waterproof.
Yeah.
And when they discovered that, which apparently was somewhere maybe at the end of the 700s, maybe beginning of the 800s, I don't know exactly, they started making bigger pieces.
Right.
Because even though they couldn't make huge sheet pieces of glasses or anything like of glass, they could make bigger objects by using the lead.
Yeah.
So it's thanks to the development of that, which happened in France, that they started making larger sections to put specifically in the churches. And so it's ironic because, of course, now nobody wants to touch lead anymore,
Well, it's kind of not good for your health.
It's not good for your health, but it was good for the stained glass windows, So there you are. And so starting by the end of the 800s, even in what mounted to really what are pre-Gothic churches, because they were making some big churches by then. They weren't making these magnificent vertical windows like we know later on in the Gothic times,
right?
But they were making bigger openings.
Okay.
And they were putting colored glass in them. And of course, at the same time, what happened was they were developing new techniques for making the color. Now, a lot of the formulas that they used in the Middle Ages have been lost.
Right. Because
this is one of those things. I mean, this is not the first time I've said it. This is not the first time I've thought about it. I'm not sure why. I mean, technologically today, we can analyze anything. We can, scientists...
Right, but that's reverse engineering. That's not the same.
Right.
It's like, well, we see what's out there. You can grind it down, maybe.
Right, and then it can analyze it chemically.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. I
don't know either. I mean, I know there are two things. One, I know that Roman mortar, talking about other things, but also by the Romans, the mortar that the Romans used when they built was so good that it lasted 2,000 years in some places. Right. Nobody knows how they did it. So somebody out there who's a scientist, will you please write in and explain?
Somebody knows. It's just that we don't know.
But same thing happened with the colored glass.
Right.
So they started techniques of making glass that was glass where the color was fused into the silicates at the time that they were making it, right? And they used cobalt for blue, and they used I think it's called timium for yellow.
Timium.
Timium. I think it's called timium. I think that's the name of it. It's something that's poisonous. That I know. All of this stuff was...
Oh, goody.
I can't imagine that these people lived a very, very long life who were making these things.
Yeah.
But little by little, since churches were, of course, so important in the early and Middle Ages, all of the innovation in architecture and innovation in everything was going on in relation to the churches. And what happened was there was the development of frescoes, which we know about that, painting on the walls, which of course the Romans had done very, very well.
Right.
And they had it even in houses. It wasn't in religious institutions. But as the techniques for making glass became a bit more sophisticated, the frescoes on the wall basically took second place to the colored glass. And the statuary, which of course all through the Middle Ages was always very, very important. And I know you love the statuary. So, it's very, very interesting to know that there was a kind of mode or phasing in of one thing in relation to phasing out of another. And then starting basically, and we're still talking about France because France was really the center for all of this. Starting in the 900s, they started making these very big churches.
Right.
None of the major cathedrals that are still standing today are from the 900s, but there were churches that were almost, not quite that big and high in terms of Gothic architecture, that they were starting to build. Our church here in Toulouse-Saint-Cernin was begun in the middle of the 1000s. And so even though it's Romanesque, we're already talking about something that has a certain imposing size to it,
yes,
right?
it is large, yeah.
It's large. It still is a church.
By comparison, Notre Dame is 1180?
1180. It started in 1180. I think 1189 was actually the official year. So obviously, we're not yet into Gothic architecture, which has to do with height more than anything else.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to know that it became more and more fashionable to use glass, and obviously it meant that there was the money for making of this kind of glass.
Yeah.
One of the very first places to start building Gothic style architecture, and this is why that period is so important, is because Gothic architecture is an architecture that is based on verticality. And it's based on the idea that you can make the churches higher and higher and higher. And that was how they worked out the idea of having buttresses right on the outside.
Right.
Because if they didn't have these flying, I love the term, flying buttresses. I always think of flying squirrels. I don't know why. Flying buttresses on the outside, the walls would collapse, which is what happened in the town of Amiens. In Beauvais. In Beauvais, twice they tried to build something so high that it just fell down both times, and they kind of went, okay, never mind, I don't think this is going to work anymore. We can only go so high, and that's the end of that.
Yeah.
But this is why I find this also fascinating. At the same time that there's a push to make bigger and bigger churches, there is a push to make more glass, and for the simple reason that there was a man, and the man's name was Abbé Suger.
Yeah.
Mr. Abbé Suger was...
I say Suger.
Suger or Suger?
I say Suger.
You say Suger.
Yeah.
I never know which is right.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I'm not going to fight about it.
Suger. I really don't know which is correct, okay? He was Abbey of the monastery of San Denis, and he was the king's priest, basically, and he was the king's theologian as well. And he wrote tracts that were doctrines about the church. He was also a man that was really very, very interesting in terms of his way of putting different ideas together. And he wrote a doctrine that talked about the divine light of God being something that you see through color.
Right.
And because of this, he instituted an idea, obviously with permission of the French king and also with having a lot of money at his disposal. And he basically told the workers, and this really starts in Saint-Denis, which is, of course, as you've been there recently, just north of the outskirts of Paris, to build as high as possible, with as much opening as possible, so that there could be as much glass as possible.
Right.
And the reason why was because he said light that goes through glass becomes divine light once it enters into a church. And the divine light is seen through color. So he was my man, okay? Because I think that color is so important.
Well, and for sure. I mean, now I have had the pleasure to photograph this myself. I was there, Saint-Denis, on a day where there was some sun part of the day, and I had my camera equipment, and I took some photos, and I'll put them on the website. And it's one of the most striking things, because you have this gray stone with patches of color that come in from a window somewhere.
Yeah.
And as the sun moves, the light changes.
Absolutely.
And if you are a monk or a religious person who spends a lot of time in the church, it would be like the rhythm of your day would be set with the change in color. Inside of the church.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, it's all dependent on getting some sunshine outside, because if it's a gray day outside, it's not going to shine through like that. And I photographed the same thing at the Sainte-Chapelle and at Notre Dame a little bit, less at Notre Dame. For some reason, when I go to Notre Dame, it's never sunny.
But it's also, I think, harder to get a close-up shot, isn't it?
Well, with the camera equipment, I can get close with, the camera will do it for me. But Notre Dame also has more white, clear windows, because they want to bring in more natural light in, so they don't have to spend quite so much on lighting, and so that kind of kills the effect because you have white. Natural light coming through, like one of our plain old uninteresting windows, competing with the light that comes through the stained glass, and so it's not quite as striking. But at Sainte-Chapelle and at Saint-Denis, it's very striking.
It's very striking.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting, though, is that the impetus for the building of the style that we know as Gothic is based on this doctrine.
Right.
That it's based on a very almost mystical idea that by looking at light coming through color, filtered through color, that you get an idea of what divine light is like. And there's something about that. There's a contemporary artist who's now, I think he's about 70 years old, but he's an artist that I really like a lot, named James Turrell. He's an American who was brought up as a Quaker, and the Quakers believe that light is divine. I mean, that's part of their basic ceremony. Excuse me if you're out there and a Quaker. I hope I'm not reducing it to a simplistic kind of thing. And his entire life's work as an artist, and I love his work, I really find it interesting, is working with light and color, both artificial light, that is inside in museums or gallery spaces where he's worked with different kinds of lights like neons and things like that, but in a very beautiful way, which it talks, he's specifically interested in the materiality of color. And also pieces outside, and it's very interesting. But
it would be interesting to try and photograph neon light like that, because I think it wouldn't photograph well. I think neon light, because of the frequency of the light, would look all green.
I don't know. I may be wrong in saying neon, but yes, there are photos of his work. I'll give you his name if you want to check it up on the thing. Yeah. But anyway, so Abbé Suger, I like to call him Abbé Suger. He wrote this doctrine, and what happened was there had already been, besides Saint-Denis, which was already being built. So he, how the workers, we still don't know the names of the architects. We don't know the names of the people who figured out how to make all of these buildings so incredibly high. The town of Chartres, which was a royal town, which is 75, 80 kilometers southwest of Paris, had already a cathedral that was a Romanesque cathedral. And when they decided to rebuild it, because it was an important town at the time, they rebuilt it as a Gothic cathedral, and they used all of this doctrine, and they had a center. Interestingly enough, it was one of the places in this area, which of course is all in Ile-de-France anyway, where they had the most important glass makers. To this day, it is the cathedral that has the most original stained glass from the very oldest times. That is, there are actually several windows that have glass that's from the 1150s.
Wow.
And the other windows are all were all made, without exception, between 1205 and 1240, which means they predate the windows that are eventually in Notre Dame, and of course even Sainte-Chapelle, which comes later. It has 2,600 square meters of glass and 172 windows. And the way that they were saved, because it is the only cathedral in France where all of the glass is the original glass, is that during World War I, and I don't know how they did it, and then World War II, they took the glass out.
Right.
And they saved it, and they put it back in. And the reason they did is because in 1914, at the very beginning of World War I, the town of Reims, which was the royal seat of coronations of the kings, and which has a cathedral which is absolutely magnificent.
Yeah, but it was bombed.
Was bombed, and all of the windows were destroyed.
Yep.
So not only were the windows destroyed, but in World War II, unfortunately, most of the statuary was destroyed. So it's wonderful to visit, but when you go there, you need to know that everything was rebuilt.
It
was rebuilt.
Again, yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary story. The story of how the Cathedral of Reims was bombed.
It was bombed and then rebuilt. What I find even on a different level more extraordinary is that Chartres, they actually managed to take it all out,
right,
and save it. And of course, the reason why Chartres is very famous is because of what is called the blue of Chartres.
Yeah.
And this blue was used. They used a special cobalt that was ground in with certain chemicals, and they made a blue that was so saturated that to this day it is absolutely mind-boggling when you see these windows. And of course, these are windows that are enormous. The verticality of Chartres is absolutely unbelievable. But what I didn't know is that I knew that Chartres was famous for all of these windows. I didn't realize that at the same time, there were several windows in Saint-Denis that are also from the 1150s.
Right. Some of them are, yes.
That are that old. So they both predate, actually, the windows of Notre Dame. And there's a third cathedral, and that is the Cathedral of Bourges.
Ben oui, la Cathédrale de Bourges is famous.
Which is famous also for having windows that were put in the very, very beginning of the 1200s. And of course, all of these are cathedrals that have windows that are magnificent. So what are Gothic cathedral windows like? Well, obviously, we're talking about windows that are extremely long, very high, very thin, that tell stories. And part of that was the idea of giving the storytelling and the metaphors, not just by the statuary on the outside, but by having people who were mostly people who could not read, be able to look at the windows and they would know the stories. You have the story of the Good Samaritan, you have the tree of Jesse, you have all the stories from the Bible. And of course, they all read from left to right, from bottom to top, always, with the special thing of Chartres and a little bit in Saint-Denis, where you can see in some of the windows that the people who paid, or the corporations who paid for the windows, are actually figured in the bottom piece so that you know who was the sponsor of the window.
Right. So if it was the bakers, they would...
Who, the bakers?
Put bakers, and if it was the whatever.
Right.
Whatever.
The bakers one is easy because you see them rolling out the dough on the table for the bread. I think there's one with carpenters where you can see them with their tools. I mean, the various corporations at the time. But what is fabulous to know is that all of these were done, without exception, between the middle of the 1100s and the end of the 1200s. And that the amount of work that went into these windows is absolutely incredible.
And, it's very fun for me to, when I photograph these, to look later at my photos and try to figure out what Bible story is this. Now, I've read the Bible a few times, so I should be able to tell. But some of them, I have no idea.
You have no idea?
No, I have to go look it up on Wikipedia because we've lost the knowledge of the symbols. Yeah. Because some of these characters are carrying something that means I'm this person or that
Right.
person. And that evolved over time too. So sometimes you think it's this character because, like Saint Peter with a key.
Right.
You'll see somebody else with a key. Well, in this instance, it's not Saint Peter because of the way the person is holding the key or something. So it's a little hard for us to tell, but I'm assuming that the people who lived in the Middle Ages had been told all these stories, and probably the clergy would have pointed at the window. You go to a sermon today, the priest is never going to say, today we're talking about the story of the tree of Jesse.
Right.
And there it is. Look
Right.
at it.
No, my guess is that they didn't even have to have the priest point out the windows. That it was oral transmission.
Yeah.
So they knew all of the stories, and they could look at them and see them. What I find mind-boggling is that it was a theological doctrine that inspired or forced, it's hard to even know what word to use, the stonemasons and the builders to figure out how to make Gothic cathedrals. The tallest Gothic cathedrals are 41 meters high. That is incredible.
It's very, very high.
It's really, really, really high. And of course, what happened was, starting with the very first ones, they pushed to have as much glass as possible and as little wall as possible, which means that they were accomplishing a feat in relation to the idea of the stability of the walls that was absolutely incredible. And there is nothing higher than 41 meters. That was that was Beauvais when they tried to go higher than 41, and it just collapsed right back on them again.
Yeah.
Now, this is one. I, years ago, lived for a while up in the northeast of France and used to visit the town of Metz, which is a town that most people don't know about. Some people have heard of Nancy because they go to see the Art Nouveau, which is it's one of the centers of what was the development of Art Nouveau. But there's a town north of Nancy called Metz, M-E-T-Z, which I used to visit a lot, and I actually liked a lot. And I remember, because this is now a while ago, going to visit the cathedral there and really thinking it was beautiful. It's interesting because, like the cathedral in Strasbourg, it's made of sandstone. So it's not made of this white limestone. It's a huge, huge, huge cathedral. And I've always wondered why most people don't ever talk about it. And then I thought, well, I guess at the time I hadn't really done a lot of my studies. I hadn't become a guide. Maybe it was just that it impressed me because it was one of the first ones I ever saw.
Right.
So I'm doing research for this little episode, and I find out that the cathedral in Metz, which was built in the 1220s, 30s, and 40s, is the cathedral in all of France with the most stained glass windows. It is the cathedral that has the biggest Gothic glass in all of Europe. It has 6,500 square meters of glass inside the cathedral. And the good part of it is still the original glass. And they call it the Lantern of God.
Oh, very poetic.
It's very poetic. It is absolutely beautiful as a Gothic cathedral. Now, it's a town that is very nice. It's off the beaten track. This is, again, I'm sort of pushing for provincial visits to, if you want to do something outside of Paris. If you're going to go to Strasbourg, it's worth stopping in Metz. It's a very nice little city. It's worth seeing this magnificent cathedral. Take a look at its absolutely gorgeous stained glass windows. And you can even stop in this museum, which is actually quite nice as well. And it was one of the first cathedrals to develop a large rose window. Now, the rose window is a convention. It's a design invented by the French, because there are Gothic cathedrals in Germany. There are Gothic cathedrals in England that have stained glass windows. But it was the French who were the first ones to create the concept of this absolutely beautiful rounded window, which was, of course, what we now call the rosace or the rose window. So it's really interesting. So I just made a little list of the places of the different cathedrals that have absolutely gorgeous Gothic stained glass. And then I just want to mention very briefly what happened after that. So, of course, Let's start from Paris because everything starts in Paris anyway. So we have, of course, Notre Dame.
Yep.
And Saint Denis, which is the Abbey of San Denis, which is really, really, really beautiful and worth seeing because it also has all of the tombs of many of the kings and queens of France.
I should mention that it's in a bit of a rough neighborhood. So if you're going to go, I would recommend maybe calling an Uber because
the entrance to the Abbey, it's not quite so bad, is it? I didn't think so.
No, there's a nice plaza right around the Abbey. It's fine, but it's just between the metro station. RER is what you take usually, and the metro station. In my case, I went in the wrong direction, and I ended up in a very frightening neighborhood, and I had all my camera equipment, so I was not a happy camper. But it was fine eventually. But it's a bit of a rough neighborhood.
Yeah, there are parts of Saint Denis that are rough, but I know that lots of people, you can actually take a guided visit in Saint Denis and go to the cathedral and the abbey. It's really beautiful. The cathedral,
it's basilica / cathedral, it's both,
right.
is very, very beautiful.
It's very beautiful, yeah. And then, of course, I haven't mentioned, but I will now mention, of course, the Sainte-Chapelle. Now, the reason I wasn't talking about that is because it's not a cathedral. It's not a major, huge thing. It's a chapel. And, of course, it was the chapel of Louis IX. And it was designed. It is, if you take away Metz, the Cathedral of Metz, which I just mentioned as having the most stained glass in relation to its structure, it is, of course, a structure that is 75% glass, right?
Wow.
And it was designed specifically by order of the King, Saint Louis, to house the crown of thorns. And therefore, he wanted to make it a beautiful private chapel.
Right.
And so it was the workers who had worked on Chartres who came and built the Sainte-Chapelle, and it is literally mostly glass, and it's absolutely fabulous.
It's amazing. Yes.
It's absolutely amazing. And the only reason I hadn't mentioned it earlier is because it is not one of these enormous cathedral type churches. It's actually a chapel, but it's around the corner from Notre Dame, and it is stupendous to look at the glass there. It's absolutely stupendous.
Must see.
Now, besides those,
especially if you have some sunshine again.
Especially if you have some sunshine. Well, that's true of all of them, right?
Yeah, but
even Chartres. I've been to Chartres, I think, 3 times. If Chartres is an enormous church, enormous, and because the windows have this incredible, very dark cobalt blue.
Yeah.
If there is no sun, it's very dark inside.
Yeah,
you know. I mean, and I remember I went there the very first time I went to Paris and took a side trip there. And then went back a number of years later. And of course, in the interim, they've actually taken out and cleaned some of the windows because they'd gotten so dark from soot and everything else that you couldn't see anything. But they're still really dark if there's no sunlight outside, in spite of the fact that it's got all these beautiful different colors, because in the case of Chartres, it has all of this very, very dark blue,
right,
which is absolutely gorgeous. Now, so we have Paris, we have Chartres, we have Reims, which has rebuilt. And so it's wonderful to see the windows in it. And also Amiens, which is a beautiful, beautiful little city northwest of Paris.
Yep. You
can get there by train, even if you don't have a car. It's actually quite beautiful. And it has a cathedral that is absolutely stupendous with a magnificent, magnificent rose window. Besides those, which of course are all more or less in the same part of France.
You also mentioned Lille earlier.
We have Lille. But in terms of the cathedrals, you have Metz, which is much further east, of course, that's going towards Strasbourg, and Bourges, which is further south.
Yes, a little south and
which
west.
It turns out, I hadn't realized, in terms of region and frontiers, is the last city in the Middle Ages before you get out of the kingdom of France and into the kingdom of Aquitaine. And so it was a frontier city that was a commercial city, very, very, very rich city. Bourges had a lot of trade of silk and all kinds of other things. Yes, that's right. They were the Bourges. Exactly. And
that's a French pun, sorry.
It has a very beautiful, beautiful cathedral. And also the city of Mans. M-A-N-S.
Mans. Pas Le Mans.
Le Mans.
Ah,
Yeah,
Le Mans, d'accord. Okay,
yeah.
Le Mans.
Which has a very beautiful cathedral.
Okay.
And which is what? West of Paris, heading towards Brittany, right?
Right.
Now there are others, obviously.
There's a Formula One racing
That's
track
the very
in Le
famous
Mans.
thing about Le Mans, right? But in fact, obviously, there are lots of other cathedrals and lots of other churches that have very pretty stained glass. But of the times, of the Gothic times, the cities that had the most beautiful stained glass windows are these.
Okay.
Right? And they're
Nothing
really,
in the south, huh?
No, except
Okay.
Carcassonne
Oh,
and Saint-Nazaire, which
yeah,
is
a little tiny Saint-Nazaire.
Saint-Nazaire, which is a church inside the old cité, the old medieval walled city of Carcassonne, which in the Middle Ages was a cathedral.
Oh, okay.
See, Carcassonne.
Small one, okay.
Carcassonne is actually a city that technically has two cathedrals because it had that one.
Yeah.
And then when they were forced to leave and rebuild the town down below, they built another cathedral.
Okay.
But of all of the cities south of the Loire, it has the most beautiful stained glass windows.
It is pretty cool in there. I got pictures of that, too.
There are 4 or 6 that are from the same time period as Notre Dame, from the 1230s and 40s. And then there are, I think, 2. I'm trying to imagine, looking in my mind at this point. I think there are either 2 or 4 that are from the century after that. So they're a little bit different because they've evolved in the Renaissance. But it's the original glass. It's all magnificent, zillions and zillions of pieces of this tiny, absolutely gorgeous, saturated color everywhere. And these are all stories from the Bible with the medallions. And of course, the color is absolutely gorgeous. Now, why other cathedrals and other churches in the South did not follow in this style? I think there were 2 reasons. Number one, the Gothic architecture came much later to the south than to the northern part of what is now France.
Yeah, in the south you find a lot of Romanesque.
A lot of Romanesque.
Churches.
Romanesque stayed longer in the south.
Okay.
And of course, part of that may be because, at least in the southwest, it didn't become a part of France until the 1300s.
Yeah.
And in the southeast, to be very honest, in Provence, I'm not sure why. But it is a fact that they copied the style of the north. And they made interesting churches with some nice stained glass. But all of the innovation and all of the really beautiful windows are all in the north, except for this strange exception of Carcassonne.
Huh.
Now, what happened was, very briefly, is that technology followed with a change in the style. So that by the time we get to the beginning of the 1400s, which is, almost 200 years later, we're full in the Renaissance. By this time, they have learned how to make larger sheets of glass.
Yeah.
Maybe not like, huge sliding glass doors like we have now, but we're talking about going from an inch or 2 piece to a piece that's maybe a foot in size. So they're still using leading, but 2 things happen. Because they can make bigger pieces and because they figured out a different technique, they use a combination of glass that is colored in the making of the glass and what they call yellow stain, which is a technique of painting certain things on the glass and putting architectural features in the background. So instead of scenes from the Bible, lots of kings and queens, large figures that are bigger than life size, with a rooftop that looks like a church or something from Jerusalem, very architectural, just like in the paintings in the background. And the folds of the clothing, which are absolutely gorgeous, are usually the part that's painted on as opposed to having the glass that's actually colored in the making of the glass.
Okay.
So if you go around, if you're really interested in stained glass, just imagine that the stained glass windows that have the most tiny little pieces of saturated color are the oldest. And as the figures get bigger and become more architectural and a little bit more realistic, then we're entering into the Renaissance. And then what happens is you have a period of the 1600s and 1700s when you go into the Baroque and there are hardly any stained glass windows at all. Because represents a time period that people don't want to refer back to anymore. And the new Baroque style is round cupolas in the church with natural openings for natural light and not painted glass anymore. And it isn't until the 19th century, I got too excited there. It isn't until the 19th century that there's a resurgence and a renaissance of interest in stained glass windows. And so here, for instance, here in Toulouse, among probably hundreds of other places in France, there was a stained glass maker named Gesta, Gesta,
Okay.
who was given the job of either refurbishing or creating the windows for a lot of the little churches in Toulouse and also the Cathedral Saint-Étienne. And the windows were absolutely gorgeous. They're different from the windows of the Middle Ages. Some of them have reproduced the idea of the decorative little pieces around the outside and then a figure or two or even a story from the Bible. The colors are different. We get purples and colors that you would never have seen any time at all in the Middle Ages. You can tell immediately that it's not medieval glass, but they're absolutely beautiful. Here in Toulouse, we have the Church of Gesu, which is a church that's a Jesuit church that is not necessarily open to the public except for certain days, that has some of the most gorgeous stained glass in the city. There's the little church in the Minimes, which has some windows by Gesta, which are also absolutely beautiful.
Oh, I've been in that a lot.
And it turns out that there's a huge revival in the middle of the 19th century because there's a surge of interest in neo-Gothic. So there's neo-Gothic architecture. And like with the paintings that all wind up showing, these women that are all sort of curvy and with all these sinuous lines, it kind of goes into Art Nouveau. All of that creates an interest in arts and crafts and in bringing back techniques that are the ancient techniques. And so once you leave the Renaissance, if you want to see really, really beautiful windows, look for churches that have windows that are from the second half of the 19th century. And they're absolutely gorgeous. And the 20th century, I don't even want to talk about, because the 20th century, believe it or not, me who loves contemporary art, it just doesn't work for me to have a couple of abstract pieces of color on a window in a church.
And one where you can see that is
At
Cahors.
no, Conque.
Conque?
Cahors too. Yeah.
Yeah, it has a lot of these weird modern.
Oh, right. Bright colors, kind of
Yeah.
flashy. Yeah. A little pop arty. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah.
And Conque is like that as well.
Conque is like that, except it's more subdued because it's whites and grays, so it doesn't hit you over the head. But it is interesting to see that the revival with the arts and crafts movement and this desire to imitate Gothic brought about a revival of people who were master glassmakers. And in fact, by the beginning of the 19th century, because a lot of things were destroyed by the French Revolution, there were actually very few master glassmakers left in France.
Yeah.
And they had to go to Germany and to England to bring back the techniques,
the
craft. And then in the second half of the 19th century, it was reused again, which is why, very honestly, I think that once you get out of the medieval times, the only other time period with really beautiful stained glass is the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, when you go like to the National Cathedral in America, it has a lot of stained glass,
Yes.
but it's this very obviously modern.
Right.
I mean, the themes are not modern, but you can see it's newish.
You can see it's newish,
Yeah.
exactly. You can see it's newish. Yes,
It doesn't look at all. It doesn't have the same feeling.
Exactly. It's part of it is the fact that it's large figures usually,
Yeah.
very large figures, and the colors are not the same as the colors that were used in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And yes, and each period has a style. Even if you aren't sure what the name of it is, you can tell it's not that ancient style.
Yeah. Or if you go to the Montreal has a was it it was Montreal, I think, that has this beautiful cathedral. You have to pay to get in, which is outrageous, but okay. But it has really beautiful stained glass, but it looks very different. Like the feeling is very different. It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous.
I mean, the thing is that except for a few of these cathedrals that I've mentioned, most of even the very biggest cathedrals now in France have some new and some old, because so many windows were destroyed. Destroyed by time, destroyed by the French Revolution, destroyed by World War II. So it's very, very unusual that, and Chartres is one of the real exceptions, to have a cathedral with all of the original glass in it. So you can see, even if you go here to Saint-Étienne, which has some Renaissance windows, then you can just walk around and you can see which ones are new and which ones are old.
And the other interesting one is at Sainte-Mère-Église.
I don't remember that.
They commissioned a piece, a stained glass piece that commemorates the American, or I'm pretty sure it's an American airborne guy hanging from he got stuck on his parachute gets stuck on the roof somewhere, and he was left hanging and he played dead. So that's commemorated in a stained glass window that was commissioned later, and I've got pictures of that too. It's very interesting how stained glass attracts the eye.
Yes.
It's a lot easier to concentrate on a piece of stained glass window longer than you would on a statue, for example.
That's true.
A statue in a church, you don't stare at it for 5 minutes, usually.
Hardly any,
Yeah, unless you're a weirdo.
Well, yeah,
like
no,
me.
I'm trying to think of, except for the ones on the outside of the Cathedral of Reims, or Notre Dame, and that's because I know them well and I know the story that some of the figures are telling. You're right. It's much easier to look at stained glass windows.
Yeah. It's more. I think Abbé Suger was on to something, that it's more contemplative and it's more speaks to a part of our souls that's hard to put your finger on, but is definitely kind of a spiritual realm type of thing. And it might be just the way I've been raised around cathedrals my whole life. So obviously, if you're from a faith tradition that doesn't have any stained glass, maybe this doesn't speak to you.
Well, at the same time, it does because, it does for me, but that's because I love color. And I think light and color is something that vibrates inside me.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it important for people. And I think that's why, in spite of the justification of, let's say, Catholic doctrine of Abbé Suger, I think that he must have had that inside him. It's like the idea didn't come just like that as an intellectual idea. The way he writes about it, you can tell that he really feels it himself. That you stand there in front of this. I mean, light. Let's face it, light and color are magical. They are.
It is. And when any of us, if you go outside at the golden hour, like it depends on the time of year, but right now it's winter in France, so it would be between 5 and 6 p.m.
Right.
Last week I was in Paris and I had a chance to, because my hotel was right by the Place des Vosges, I walked through there a few times, including one time where it was like 5:15 p.m. Well, the light was completely different.
Yeah.
It looked so different. And of course I took some pictures. But it's... Yeah, I think it's very, if you wake up and you have a beautiful sunrise or a gorgeous sunset with reds in the sky or whatever, of course we notice.
It's magical.
We don't notice the wind. We don't notice other things. We don't notice as much, but that we notice.
I think that's it. And I think the idea that the other thing is, look, here in Toulouse, we have also a church called the Jacobin, which has absolutely beautiful modern stained glass windows that reiterate a theme that was started when it was built, which was in the end of the 13th century. The idea that sunlight filters through the glass that's colored, and creates a kind of kaleidoscope effect. And it's very magical because it looks like something alive.
It does.
And one of the things that Suger wrote about was making the inside of a cathedral be like an example of what paradise would be like. Mm-hmm. Well, I have no idea what paradise is like or if it exists.
Right.
But I wouldn't mind if it looked like a kaleidoscope, actually.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
It would be kind of nice.
I mean, give you a headache after a while.
Maybe, especially if it's moving all the time. But it is kind of neat. And it is neat to know. There's also, for me, the mystery of these craftspeople 800 years ago who knew how to do these things and modestly went about doing them and constructing these windows that are 100 feet tall, and that are filled with thousands and thousands of pieces.
There must have been lots of artisans working on them.
Must have been.
Yeah,
there must have been. What they do know is that they would make what, of course, is called a cartoon, which means a drawing, to lay it all out. Because if the bakers said, "Well, we're paying for this window, but we want the story of the Good Samaritan," well, but that's what they had to do. Then they were left to design the shape of the medallions and the shape of the decoration on the outside and figure out how to get all the story in and how many episodes they were going to have before you get to the top.
They had to do a
storyboard, and then you have to work it out. And who knows? They do it on planks of wood. I mean, I have no idea. I have twice visited glassmakers in Chartres, just as a brief visit to see what they do. One of whom, this is a number of years ago, was certified to work on the cathedral, because that means that he was a compagnon, he was a member of the guild, and said that, it's an extremely enormous privilege, but it's so arduous and so slow going because they're supposed to use the techniques as close to the ancient techniques as possible. Yeah. So he said,
you don't rush anything.
You don't rush anything. So for him, it was the honor of doing that, and the way he made money was making beautiful pieces that looked like Tiffany lamps or something like that,
right.
and that was it. Because he said,
also very nice.
It's kind of nice.
Yeah.
Another cathedral that's beautiful that has some very interesting windows, but they're a little bit later, is in Bayeux, in Normandy. The windows, they're 1400s windows mostly. They're not as old. I don't honestly know if they are the originals or whether they were rebuilt or not.
Don't know.
I don't know.
Oh, it's going to be fun for this episode. I'm going to have to go look through all my pictures. I have thousands of pictures of stained glass windows because it's a challenge to photograph them right.
Yes.
And they attract the eye, so obviously you photograph them. If you have a camera around your waist, like I do most of the time, you do photograph
And really,
them.
for people who are in Paris who want to see close up how the pieces were made, go to the Cluny Museum.
Yeah, the Cluny Museum.
It's so wonderful.
It's not a big room. It's a room that's probably, I don't know.
Size of here? I don't know.
It's a little bigger than it's the size of a dining room table.
Right.
But it's lovely because you're right. It's right at eye level and you can see.
The little pieces.
Yeah, you can see how they're put together and all that.
I mean, some of these pieces are a half an inch by an inch, and then you have a little bit of painted on to do the eye or the nose or something like that, and you think,
and they're lit from behind. So you can really see the color comes through. Whereas if you go to a real church, well, a lot of these stained glass windows are very high,
and you can't see the tops,
and you can't see the detail. That's one of the sad things about it, is because most of these stained glass windows, they start at 4 or 5 meters high.
Yes,
because they had to have the weight of the wall to support the weight of the glass above it. So they couldn't start the stained glass window any lower, I don't think. Structurally, I'm not an architect, but I assume that's why because they all like that.
They're all like that, right.
All of them, the glass starts quite high and goes even higher. And so if you have a big zoom lens like I do, you can try and, catch details, and some of these details are amazing. I mean, you're going to have devils and all sorts of things.
And did you know this? And this is another thing that I learned when I was just doing some research for this. Just like with the painted ceilings, the windows have distortion in the figures higher up, so that from down below they look normal.
Right.
So it's art. This is art.
Yeah. This is an art.
This is an art. I mean, this is just like when Michelangelo did the Sistine Chapel, or any other artist that has to paint a ceiling. They have to compensate for the distance and the curve or whatever it is. Right. And they did the same thing in these flat sections of glass, calculating all of this as it goes up to the top. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing.
And so this is an interesting episode because, I mean, it's a bit... when you suggested it yesterday, I was like, oh, that's cool to me. But I'm not sure how many people will really be super interested in this. But it doesn't matter to me. If it's interesting to me and to you, we should talk about it.
Absolutely. And I think that for people who
and there are probably a
go
lot
to
of
the
people,
churches and really are impressed by the stained glass windows.
And maybe once you know a little bit about it, you might get more appreciation for what you're looking at. Because honestly, we're in such a vibrant world of color and imagery today that I don't know that the young people really appreciate this maybe they do. I don't know.
I don't know. But I think that people going into churches often look at the windows and wonder, why were they made like that? Why are they so big? Why are they this? Why are they that? And yes, there are contemporary artists who do work, not just silly neon signs and stuff like that, which is very silly, but who are actually trying to take this idea of light as a physical phenomena and color and use it as a way of making something that can be looked at that's the equivalent of what was done in those days, only except it's not in a church, it's in an art gallery.
Right. All right, Elyse, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful afternoon of recording episodes.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Annie. It's been so much fun, and I'm so glad to be back after my little knee accident and all the rest. So there you are.
Yes, you're better.
I'm better. I'm better. The mouth is going. I'm better.
And we'll enjoy some chocolates.
Oh, yum. Bye, everybody.
Au revoir. Thank you, Kendra Gilbertson, Abby Forget, and Ella Stasi Broslavsky, forgive me for not knowing how to say your name properly, for pledging to support the show on Patreon this week. And my thanks to all the other patrons who support the show month after month. Thank you for giving back. Would you buy me a coffee if we met in real life? Well, you can do that by supporting the show on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. Visit patreon.com/join us to see the different reward tiers, and thank you so much for giving back. I've added a few photo rewards to those who support the show at the $2 level, and I'll be adding a lunch break French as well as a French history brief between Christmas and New Year. Okay, let's talk about the Gilets jaunes a little bit. Things are calming down. Yesterday, there were 3,000 protesters in Paris, but there were also 8,000 police force. And so, of course, it's fizzling, as it always does. In towns, in cities like Nantes and Bordeaux, things were a lot more, people are still a lot more excitable. In Toulouse, it was fairly calm yesterday. I was in the city yesterday, and it seemed quite calm, at least where I was. And that's the problem with these sorts of events, is that the demonstration is a big deal if you're right where it's happening, but if you're just a few blocks away, you don't know that it's happening. So going forward, the Gilets jaunes will probably fizzle even more next Saturday and the Saturday after that, but that doesn't mean that this is over, because there are a lot of French people who are not happy about the situation. This is going to sound a little bit political, but I think what unites all of these people is that, one, they're not happy with who got elected, and two, they would like more money. And that's very broad, right? It used to be that you couldn't organize ad hoc demonstrations like this because it took a lot of organization to do this. So only unions could do this sort of thing. But now you can do it on Facebook. It's pretty easy. And this one has really caught people's imagination. Apparently, there are demonstrations with Gilets jaunes in Belgium, in Poland. I heard about some in South America. So if there are countries where people are inclined to do demonstrations, the whole idea of just putting on your safety vest and that somehow unites all these people together is is really attractive. So I think it will pop up again. But the government has learned a lot from these demonstrations. I think people who do the security have learned a lot about these demonstrations. And I think that on the one hand, Emmanuel Macron, our president, is going to encourage large companies who do business in France to be a little bit more generous with their bonuses and their pay packages. I mean, it's a reality that people in France have much lower salaries than they do in the US, for example, for same level of education. So it's a fact that salaries in France are lower overall, and not as low as Spain, for example, but still it's pretty low. And so I think that the president needs to convince corporations to be more generous, or all of this populist sentiment might bring a populist leader to power next time. And some people might think that's good for business. Some people might think it's not good for business. And so these corporations need to they make a lot of money in France. I mean, there are huge American corporations like Apple, Amazon, Google that pay hardly any taxes in France because of the way they are structured, because they will declare income in other countries and they say somehow, well, we make millions in France, but we don't have to pay taxes. And they're just taking advantage of globalization because the markets are globalized, but the taxes are not globalized. The tax structure is not globalized. And so they're just taking advantage of this situation. So I don't know what they can do, but I do believe that Macron is doing the right thing by trying to put more money into these people's pockets, because it's either that or he's out and some totally crazy politician gets in next time, and that would be a big problem. But don't be surprised, even if my analysis is completely wrong, which it might be. I'm not a politician. Don't be surprised if you see this popping up again in the months and years to come, because French people just protest a lot more than Americans. And American media and English media likes to make hay of things that are very, very localized. And they show you something terrible that happened in one spot, and they make it feel like it's happening all over the country. It really isn't. But I mean, honestly, French media loves to make hay of anytime there's a shooting in America. You can be sure that there's going to be dozens of articles about, we don't understand how anybody can live in America. It's just so awful. They're all going to get shot or something to that effect. So the media in my country likes to make hay of things that happen abroad and vice versa. It's just how it works, because they want clicks and they want to rile people up to read their newspapers, I guess. I don't know. I suppose that nice stories about, people walking their dogs and feeding their children are not going to make it to the newspaper. It's just how it is. Anyway, so things are coming down. I don't see any reason why anybody should cancel a trip on account of that or any other demonstrations in France. It will be just fine. And again, happy holidays to all of you. Try to think of happy thoughts during the holidays, except instead of all of this stuff. If you liked this episode, you should also check out episode 181, which is the story of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And maybe, for a little balance, episode 84 about Voltaire, the free thinker. As you know, because you are listening to me right now, you can hear Join Us in France anywhere you get your podcasts. But if you want to help other people listen to the show to prepare their own trip to France, then tell them that they can listen on Pandora, Spotify, Alexa, Google Home, YouTube, and on joinusinfrance.com as well. It was very nice. Somebody posted on the Facebook group that they had been listening on the website, And because they heard me talk about this, they did it from their Google smartphone, and it's working. And she was like, oh, this is so nice. I can listen anywhere on my phone. Yeah, you can. And there are a lot of people. I mean, I've been listening to podcasts for 15 years. So to me, it's obvious. But podcasts, even though half American adults listen to podcasts, the other half doesn't. So they need a little help figuring out how to listen. And if you want to be extra nice to these people, if you think you've heard an episode that they would really benefit from, then you can go to the Join Us in France page, not the group, but the page. And from there, you can reply and tag the person. Or you can also go to that episode page on joinusinfrance.com and use the share buttons to share that particular episode to either their Facebook timeline or send it to them as a private message. You can make it really easy for them. And if you are wondering if we've talked about a place you're thinking of visiting, well, use the search button on the website because we've talked about a lot of places. I want to say how much I appreciate the lively Join Us in France Facebook on the closed group on Facebook. It's calmed down a little bit, but I think everybody is so busy preparing for the holidays. But you guys share wonderful information. You're very generous with your time and wanting to help other people have a great time in France. So that's wonderful. And of course, if you want your comments to be a lot more permanent, then put them on the episode page rather than just on Facebook, because on Facebook, they'll just disappear very, very quickly. And on the episode page, they'll be there years later. And if you have something of value to share, please share it by either calling the show voicemail at 1-801-806-1015, or posting it, like I just said, as a comment on the episode page. Have a great week of trip planning. Have wonderful holidays, and I will talk to you next week. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2018 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.